Well, good morning. This is Barry Odell with the Church of Christ at Mammoth Spring Facebook page. It is Tuesday morning, October 12th, 2021. And as soon as I start, I get a phone call. All right, good to see you folks joining on today. Hello, Lyle. Good morning, Connie. Hopefully we're starting off all right today with audio. We've got picture. I think we got the audio issues straightened out the other day, though. We are in Acts chapter 23, and we are discussing Paul having been arrested in Jerusalem, and he is now going to start his, I guess this is what you could call the end to his third missionary journey. So the third journey, let me look back here real quick. The third journey started at the end of chapter 18, about verse 22 and 23, and he ends up in Jerusalem. He ends up getting arrested, and that's it for his, I guess what we would call his voluntary missionary journeys. From here on out, he is headed to Rome ultimately. Good morning, Brian. There's Diana and Linda. Good to see everybody on here today. We often, and I've mentioned this already, but I'll mention it in passing, we often talk about the 4 mission trips of Paul. In reality, he only took 3 of his own accord, let's say it that way. His trip to Rome is as a prisoner. There's Gail, and there's Barry and Glenda. All right, guys, we're in, again, Acts chapter 23. Paul's been arrested. He's been given an opportunity to speak before the Sanhedrin. He is, well, it's like it just never stops for Paul. Once he converted to Christ, his life never slows down. Constant persecution. People are constantly pursuing him to kill him, to shut him up, and it's no different here. Again, as he was arrested in Jerusalem, he is now standing before the Sanhedrin, which is in his presence. He's talking to both some Sadducees and some Pharisees, and he sees that division. They're united together against him up until this point. And then he talks about the fact, well, I've been arrested because I've been preaching the hope of the resurrection from the dead. Well, that set the Pharisees into almost defense mode for Paul. Well, he's not done anything wrong. It's interesting to see their change here in Acts chapter 23, verse 9. We find no evil in this man. So now the contention comes between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and so for a moment we'll say the attention was turned away from Paul to into the midst of the Pharisees and Sadducees, and then Christ reassures him that he had testified for him in Jerusalem. Well, now he's going to do so in Rome also, and this kind of begins that process here, Acts 23, beginning in verse 11, through the end of the book of Paul's, I guess we'll say, journey to Rome, but it's a journey as a prisoner. So what we have here in chapter 23, verses 11 through 22, is a plot that is hatched against Paul. There are some Jews, verse 12, who band together. They take an oath, and they're not going to eat anything or drink anything until they have killed Paul. And there were more than 40 who formed this conspiracy. And so we're not going to, you don't have to go into great detail. This is just a historical account of what took place in Acts 23, beginning in verse 12. Well, it's found out that these more than 40 men have taken this vow. In fact, it's found out by Paul's nephew, verse 16. Paul's sister's son heard of the ambush. And so preparations are made to protect Paul from this. They want him to be held on trial. They don't want him to be, obviously, to be killed by these 40 guys who have taken a vow to kill him. And so again, that goes down through verse 22. And essentially his life is saved at this point in time by his nephew. But you will notice, as you keep reading this chapter, Paul's nephew is permitted to go speak to the commander, the guy kind of in charge of Paul. He tells him the plot, that these guys have taken a vow to kill Paul. And so verse 22 says, the commander let the young man depart and commanded him, tell no one that you have revealed these things to me. And so what transpires after that is Felix, okay, and this is his full name, Marcus Antonius Felix. He was the Roman governor of Judea from AD 52 to 58. He kind of takes credit himself for gallantly, bravely saving the life of Paul. Well, that's not exactly how it went, but being a politician, we know how they function. He takes credit for Paul's escape from this vow that people have taken. So he writes a letter to Claudius from verses 20. It's recorded in verses 26 through 30 about how he saved Paul's life and all of this good stuff. He prepares 470 men. So 40 guys have taken this vow. They're not going to eat or drink until they've killed Paul. Well, he now prepares 470 men to take Paul safely to Felix, who was a Roman governor. And they do this at night. And so if you look at Acts 23 and verse 23, it says, "And he called for 2 centurions, saying, Prepare 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen, to go to Caesarea." So remember, he's in Jerusalem. He's been arrested in Jerusalem. Well, now we're going to take him to Caesarea, and this is going on at the 3rd hour of the night. Well, this would be approximately 9 p.m. So provisions were made, and bring him safely to Felix the governor. Again, the commander writes a letter, Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor, Felix. And again, he takes credit for stepping in and saving Paul's life. So I see a comment here. I'll touch on this real quick. Hey, David, good to see you, by the way. David says it's probably good Paul was a single man because most families probably could not put up with that pressure of having a wife and children, especially in our society here in America today as far as persecution goes. Yeah, and Paul talks about what he refers to as his gift, you might say, that he was not bound by a wife. He wasn't, boy, being a married man and knowing that my wife is watching, I better be careful how I say this. He was not limited at all in where he could go or what he could do. If you have a wife and you have children, you have familial obligations, and God expects you to meet those. Whereas a single man can, he'd just go. And there's no concern for the domestic responsibilities of a father and a husband. And so, I suppose as a missionary, we could see the benefits of that. But I tell you, as a father and a husband, I wouldn't have it any other way. Being married and having children adds so much richness to your life that God designed. Marriage is God's will. But there are those who can be, as Jesus talks about in Matthew 19. Now that's in the context of divorce and remarriage, but Jesus talks about those who would be eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. There are people who can do that and who do that, and that's commendable, and they'll receive their own reward. But not everybody's like that. And so Paul was not bound, let's say it that way, to domestic responsibilities. And so anyway, this situation occurs. Paul's life is saved, ultimately by his nephew, even though someone else takes credit for it, and he's going now to Caesarea. They took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatus. The next day left the horsemen to go with him and returned to the barracks. So anyway, they came to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor. This is Acts 23 and verse 33. The governor read it. He asked what province he was from. Well, I was from Cilicia. He said, I will hear you when your accusers also have come. And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's praetorium, or judgment hall. So he's awaiting trial, essentially. You got to have the witnesses there, and that's what he is waiting for. And so for 5 days, we get into Acts chapter 24. After 5 days, Ananias the high priest came down with the elders and a certain orator named Tertullus. These gave evidence to the governor against Paul. So chapter 24 covers this account, and again, it's just a historical record of what took place, not really, to me, not really a whole lot of commentary to be added here. So what we have in Acts 24 in verses 1 through 9 is basically Tertullus kind of kissing up to the governor, talking about his foresight and how thankful he is and all the peace they enjoy because of this guy's rule. Well, then he gets into the false charges against Paul. We found this man, Acts 24 and verse 5, a plague, a creator of dissension among all the Jews throughout the world. Well, that's interesting. So everywhere Paul goes, he's preaching the gospel that's been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit, and he's the one who's charged with dissension and division. And it's so interesting because that's exactly the way it happens today. Now, from the Jewish perspective, okay, Paul writing letters, all right, like, again, the book of Galatians has already been written by this time, and he writes about the fact that you cannot be justified by the law of Moses. Circumcision cannot save you. If you attempt to be justified by the law, you've fallen from grace. I mean, all of that is within the book of Galatians. And so from a Jewish perspective, I guess you could say, he was causing dissension. People who were of a Jewish background were obeying the gospel because of the preaching and writing of Paul. So I guess from their perspective, he is a divisive fellow. I don't know that we would call him a plague, but he certainly was causing trouble by the preaching of the gospel in the Jewish world. And then he says this in Acts 24 and verse 5, a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Well, you think of Jesus Christ, he shall be called a Nazarene, the region where he was from. So this is one of those perceptions that the world had of the church. And, you know, it's so interesting because history kind of repeats itself. So today people look at the Church of Christ and they say, oh, you're that Campbellite church, aren't you? And so these misnomers are out there. The church, as we read these last few chapters of Acts, on more than one occasion it's called a sect. Well, the world looked at the church then as a sect of Judaism. You know, so you had the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Zealots. You had these different groups within the larger body of Judaism. And a lot of folks looked at the church as just another one of those sects within Judaism. And that's not what the church is. And so, like I said, history kind of repeats itself. People look at the Lord's church today and they say, you're a Protestant denomination, or you're a Campbellite church, or you're a descendant of the American Restoration movement. And when you hear those kind of statements, you know, or at least you should know automatically, that whoever makes those charges, they're the type of person who knows just enough to show their ignorance. They know a few, what's the word? They know a few kind of like catchphrases, false accusations against the church. Oh, Campbellites, Protestant. They know just enough to show how ignorant they truly are of Scripture and of the Lord's church that is described in Scripture. So anyway, Paul is called a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He tried to profane the temple, and we arrested him. Well, he didn't try to profane the temple. So again, these are trumped-up charges, but he is accused of sedition. So beginning in verse 10 down through verse 21, Paul is permitted to defend himself against these charges. Well, for everything that he is charged with, verse 5, a plague, a creator of dissension among all the Jews throughout the world, all of this, profaning the temple, etc. Paul makes a point here. He didn't have enough time to do all that. He said, listen, I've only been in Jerusalem for 12 days, verse 11. And so the charges are demonstrably false. Paul hadn't been there. He hadn't been there long enough to do everything that was kind of laid at his feet. If he could do that in 12 days, boy, that'd be something, wouldn't it? But he didn't do that. They didn't find me in the temple disputing with anyone, Acts 24 and verse 12. Again, in the synagogues, they cannot prove the things of which they accuse me. See, one of the things that I pick up here in Acts chapter 24 is truth is not afraid of examination. Paul's not afraid to be examined. I mean, the evidence, the truth is on his side. So, you know, as Christians, we need to always remember that. If someone questions you about your faith or they have questions about the church, great. If you know the truth, you don't have to be afraid of that. You don't have to be afraid to talk to them or to answer their questions. I know some people are kind of hesitant to get into religious back and forths, okay, religious dialogues, because they feel that's unchristlike. Well, I would say the exact opposite is true. That's exactly what Jesus did. That's exactly what Paul did. If you're standing for the truth, you have no fear of being questioned. You have no fear of even a difficult examination, which certainly Paul's going through here, but they can't prove anything they're charging against me, Acts 24, verse 13. But now he does admit this. Acts 24:14. This I confess to you, that according to the way which you call a sect, which they call a sect, so I worship the God of my fathers, believing all the things which are written in the law and in the prophets. I have hope in God, which they themselves also accept, that there will be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. This being so, I myself always strive to have a conscience without offense towards God and man. And there's Sheila. Good morning, Sheila. So, again, he's not afraid of questioning, because, again, the truth is on his side, and he admits, okay, this is what I'm doing. You guys call the church a sect of the Nazarenes. It's been called the way now like 4 or 5 times in the book of Acts. He says, that's how I worship God. And to me, that's a pretty strong argument. So there are people within the churches of Christ who say, well, there's no real pattern for worship in the pages of the New Testament. Paul says something quite different right here. He's talking about the church. And what verse? Verse 14 again. He says, but this I confess to you, that according to the way, which they speak of as a sect, so I worship the God of my fathers. There was a manner in which the way, the church, worshiped the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And it's laid out in the pages of the New Testament. And so there's this weird belief out there by some, even in the churches of Christ, who say, hey, worship, the New Testament doesn't really lay it out. Particularly those who are in favor of instrumental music, they like to make that argument. It's a very weak argument and has no scriptural basis. The New Testament lays it out for us very, very clearly. You're not gonna find a list like the 10 Commandments, okay, in the New Testament of, okay, here's what you do in worship. But we see what they did in worship. I mean, it's just laid out for us. We have this historical document called the Book of Acts that records it for us. We have the letters that were written to congregations, and it discusses these things too. And Paul admits it. Yeah, this is how I worship God. And that's how the way, the what you call the sect, I worship God just like they do. And so, that was kind of off topic. Well, not really off topic, but anyway, he strives to have a conscience without offense toward God and men. Now, after many years, I came to bring alms and offerings to my nation, in the midst of which some Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with a mob nor with tumult. And of course, that refers back to Acts chapter 21. They ought to have been here before you to object if they had anything against me. Or else let those who are here themselves say, if they have found any wrongdoing in me while I stood before the council, unless it is for this one statement, which I cried out standing among them concerning the resurrection of the dead, I am being judged by you this day. Everything they're saying is false. Here's what I have done. If they've got something else, let them bring it. Otherwise, from Paul's perspective, you might say, well, this is done. So Felix hears all this. All right, again, we've gone from Jerusalem to Caesarea. You might say he's kind of moving up the chain of authority in the Roman government. And Felix looks at all this. He stops the proceedings. He keeps Paul in custody. Okay, we see that. But he gives him freedom. I guess you might say it's something like house arrest. He adjourned the proceedings, verse 22. And verse 23, he commanded the centurion to keep Paul and to let him have liberty, and told him not to forbid any of his friends to provide for or visit him. So, what Jesus promised him back in Acts 23 and verse 11 appears to be taking place now. While he is still under arrest, he does have liberty during that time. And so the rest of this chapter records the fact that Felix, verse 24, his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, they heard him concerning the faith in Christ. And he reasoned with them about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. Okay, I love this right here. let's see, righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. So this is something that I've dealt with over the last few years. You know, people, they're out there teaching, well, the final judgment, the return of Christ happened in AD 70 in Jerusalem. Okay, it's just an absolutely foolish doctrine that has no scriptural foundation. Paul's talking in Caesarea to a non-Jewish man and a Jewish woman, and he talks to them about the judgment to come. Well, this obviously was written before AD 70, but we're way outside of Jerusalem now. And he's talking to a Jew and a non-Jew. So, anyway, I thought I would throw that in because, like I said, I've dealt with this personally over the last few years. And I've had people come on my Facebook page and my YouTube channel promoting all this garbage. And I finally just blocked them all because they're ridiculous. They're unreasonable. And frankly, I got sick of it. Anyway, that's how the chapter ends. And Paul, again, under arrest with some freedom. Felix's response here is always interesting to us, I suppose, in Acts 24 and verse 25. Go away for now. When I have a convenient time, I will call for you. So far as we know, that convenient time never came. But he kept, in hopes of getting money, he kept Paul bound. And so he would talk to him, verse 26, he would converse with him. But after 2 years, think about that. He was in Jerusalem for 12 days. He's under house arrest. He's got some freedoms, but for 2 years, Paul's in this condition. Porcius Festus succeeded Felix, and Felix, wanting to do the Jews a favor, left Paul bound. So this Festus, as we read of here in Acts 24:27 and then in chapter 25, he was a Roman governor of Judea from AD 58 to 60. So anyway, that's where chapter 24 ends, and that's where we are going to end today. Connie says, I don't see how people can believe Christ has come already. It's true. Connie, hey Debbie, by the way. Connie, it is quite amazing. It's quite amazing that people are so delusional and dishonest. I think those are two good words. Delusional and dishonest with the scriptures, as to believe something as foolish as that. But hey, they do. All right, so if you've got the material, page 36, I kind of, summarize Paul's third missionary journey from Antioch, 1822, and it ended there in Jerusalem, Acts 21, verses 1 through 15, when he was arrested. He's then moved from Caesarea, he appeals to Caesar, and then ultimately he's taken to Rome, and that's the rest of the book of Acts. All right, guys. Good to see everybody here today. I appreciate the interaction with the video. You're always welcome to do that if you have any questions or comments about anything I say. If you have somebody who would like to do these studies who does not do Facebook, send them over to our YouTube channel, Mammoth Spring Church of Christ, and all this content is uploaded there. Plan on coming back tomorrow at 11 o'clock, and we will pick up in Acts chapter 25. All right, guys. Hope you have a good day, and hope to see you back here tomorrow.